It's my pleasure to welcome today Mr. Scott McDonald, President and CEO of Oliver Wyman, to discuss with us today the issue of COVID-19 and the world economy. Thank you very much, Scott, for taking the time to be with us today. I know your schedule is very busy, but it's much appreciated.
My pleasure, Omar, and I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you very much, Scott. So over the past 3 months, we've experienced a disruption in the economy unprecedented in modern history. And with it has come an extreme level of volatility and uncertainty about what's next. So I'd like to ask you a very, let's say, easy question to start with, which is, where do you view the economy post-COVID-19, and what will be the legacy of this experience?
So you decided to start with an easy question.
Exactly.
Omar, I think so much of the future economic impact is going to depend on how the health issues play out, and whether or not we see second waves of the virus and how effective the methods we use to suppress it are. But I think there's huge error bars around any prediction on this. But I'll still give you one, and it'll tell you at least what I see out there. And it's basically that the impact we're seeing now on people's incomes and on balance sheets, is much deeper and more significant than anything we've seen for a very long time. And if you look at the current predictions around GDP or unemployment, either globally or for really any part of the world, they're severe, and they look more like a once in a 50 to 100 year shock than the end of a typical 6 to 8 year business cycle. And they feel much more, to me, if you try and cast your mind back over a slightly broader period of history than just a decade or so, it feels much more like 1930 than 2008. And as a result of that, we're seeing the inevitable, really, really significant intervention by governments, where governments have the firepower to do that. And it's important to remember that's not everywhere. That's only some places they can do it. But significant printing of money, significant redistribution of wealth, even though we don't yet quite know where we're redistributing from or to. We're doing it now, and we're going to have to spend some time doing the reckoning of that in the future. And I think if you put that all together, you see this as a pretty severe drop in activity, pretty severe drop in income, pretty severe challenge to the balance sheets of both small and big companies. And it's going to take a number of years to work out. And I think this isn't something you work out in 3 months or 6 months or 9 months. It probably takes a couple of years at least. And during that period, I think, it really depends, the speed with which we can move depends on the virus itself. If we find there's a second wave that comes back in the fall and we're all locked down again, it'll only amplify the effect and cause more damage. So I know that's not a very optimistic answer, but I think the summary is, this is a deep impact on the economy. It's going to take some years to work out. Like always, we will work our way out of this. And we will get back to business, and we will get back to cooperating and making progress and hopefully driving productivity once again. But I think it's going to take some time.
You mentioned comparisons to the 2008 crisis and even the Great Depression, Scott. Do you think that the governments today have the tools needed to be able to confront this crisis? It seems as of right now, many of the tools are more similar to what we saw in 2008. Are there additional things we need to be thinking of which might be more analogous to the type of tools we used in the Great Depression?
Well, I think if you think about, ultimately government programs have to target incomes so they can stimulate demand, and they have to target balance sheets so they can stimulate continued business and employment. And both of those things are linked. I think when we went through the financial crisis in 2008, we pulled out for the first time in a long time very significant stimulus of all sorts of types in all the main developed countries, at least. And I think at that time, there was a lot of talk about, we'd used up all our ammunition. There wasn't much left, and monetary policy would be less effective in the future. And still, that was back in 2008. Still, we've been talking about since then. No one quite knows how we were going to unwind that stimulus. It's being unwound over time, but it's not even completely done. And then, only 10 years or 12 years later, and I think this is changing by the day because the stimuluses are growing, but the amount governments have committed this time are many multiples of what we committed in 2008, and we have much less to start with. And so, I've been reading about the various countries, and I think that the numbers range from 4 to sort of 10 times what we used then, with far less potentially effective tools. But I think, I think it's the right and only thing to do at the moment, and all of the effort has to be in making sure that gets to the right places, because these are enormously complicated programs. And once you lift up the lid and say, will they actually work, and will they get to the right place? How corrupt will they be, and how many people will take advantage of them? That's a big question. And we haven't even started talking about, and who will pay for them? How will we divide up the cost of these amongst the various people that could pay for them? So I think the programs they're clearly necessary. I can't see too much more we can do. We can continue to extend, and we can continue to increase the size, and maybe you're right, there are more creative ways to allocate the distribution.
So one major difference between the current crisis and that of 2008 is the environment in which we're operating in. And today we see much more economic nationalism and populism than we did during the financial crisis. And so the question I have for you, Scott, is, do you think the current COVID experience will result in greater cooperation in the future, realizing that we need a global solution to a global problem, or cause countries to be even more isolationist going forward?
So I think there's between the financial crisis and now, there's definitely been a drift in our behavior as people and as a world towards one end of the spectrum. Like, I've always thought that we always have two elements of our nature in us, and we're always battling. And one element is the desire to collaborate and cooperate and try and create a better world, and try and drive productivity on the economic side through that collaboration. And the other side is, a more tribal nature, where we revert to protecting our own and whatever our tribes are. And I think, like, again, when you look through history, when the world comes under pressure, we seem to veer towards the tribal side. And I think that's what we've been seeing over the last 10 years. The concerns around income equality and many people feeling under enormous pressure have shifted us a little more towards nationalist tendencies and protectionist policies, and put a bit of a cap on globalization. I think that trend was already here before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic probably exacerbates it in the short term. And it's like that's a prediction rather than a desire, because I think the answer lies in the opposite. I think it's just going to be pretty hard to achieve in the next couple of years.
I agree. As you say, it's probably not the most desired outcome, but unfortunately probably the most realistic one. Now, the next question I have for you is actually more about the industry level. The question I have is, which industries do you see coming out of this crisis faster than others?
It's interesting. When I do think about the industries, and we do a lot of work on Oliver Wyman at this, trying to plot, which industry is being most affected, and you end up with a chart with a very heavy balance on the left-hand side, where most are being affected pretty badly. And we do a lot of business in the transportation airlines industry and the hospitality sector, for instance, and they've clearly just been decimated because they've gone from booming businesses to businesses with no business at all. And I think as we think about people coming out the other end, I mean, everyone will be trying to innovate, change their business models, and do new things. But some will be significantly hampered, by the continued health threats. And to the extent that we have some sort of social distancing in place for, more than months, and and some of the estimates run to years rather than months, it will really damage the direct sort of consumer-facing businesses. So airlines or hotels or gyms or cinemas, I think they will really struggle to come out of this, even as they change business models and try and be more innovative. Then there's probably a group of businesses in the middle, that have been severely negatively affected by this. That would include manufacturing, energy, business services, health, retail, which probably spans the spectrum, which I think they have a little more flexibility because they can change the model slightly. They can change the way they think about supply chains. They can change the way they think about how they work, and they can change the way they think about how they affect their customers. So if they do that well, there's a chance that they can make some progress. And then there are a bunch of businesses, I think, who are and should thrive. Those who are more focused on delivery or online services or technology services. Those should only grow in demand. So I think there's a lot of scope for movement there, but I think there's a large group of companies who are going to struggle. But amongst all of them, I think there's going to be enormous innovation required. At the moment, everyone now is trying to put out their hair because it's on fire, but I think soon they'll be focused on what they want to change.
So you mentioned business model changes. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what permanent changes you see going forward as a result of the COVID crisis?
Well, I think some of the obvious things that we see are, all businesses can probably become more digital, and that would give them a bit of a hedge against this type of crisis in the future. Although I saw this year, I was watching Neil Ferguson, the historian, and he was talking. It was in January of the year, and we were talking about climate, because that's what everyone was talking about in January, if you remember, except some of the people in Asia who were talking about the virus. And he said, given that the whole world is focused on climate, it's almost certainly not going to be the thing that drags us down. He said it'll be something like a pandemic. And it does make me think that you got to be very careful not to try and solve for the last problem. So setting that aside, like when you think about business model changes, you can become more digital. You certainly, I think, can change the nature of work to some extent. Where do people work from and how do they work? And that could have quite a profound impact on real estate footprints, amount of money spent on travel, entertainment, conferences, things like that, and could really change the cost structure of some businesses. Mine's an interesting example. We have, the consulting industry, we tend to have the whole group traveling all the time, generally working with clients on client sites. But back in our offices, maybe a day or two a week. So we have large real estate footprints, usually in very expensive places. You can see that changing pretty quickly.
So Scott, one of the sectors which people are particularly concerned about are the small and mid-sized firms, as well as the startups. What impact do you think this crisis is going to have on them in particular?
So I think it's going to be tough. And I think there's two reasons that really work against them, and then one that works in their favor. The things that work against them is, they often will have weak balance sheets. They're just younger, smaller companies, and this is going to be puts pressure on everyone's balance sheet, puts enormous pressure on cash. And even the biggest, most stable companies are struggling with cash now. And if you're a small business, I think you're going to struggle even more. So I expect to see a lot failing in the current environment. The second thing I think we'll see happen is that the valuations of small companies, especially innovative tech-related companies, have gone through the roof in the last 10 years and have just continued to go up. And I think that will come down very quickly now because the benefits of scale and stability will be strong, at least for a while. So I think they have those two things working against them. the thing that works for them, like always, is that they should in theory be better and faster at innovating. And I think the next few years will be a time where innovation should be rewarded. So there should still be an interesting opportunity for them, but I think it's going to be a tough time for the smallest companies.
So Scott, you mentioned changes in the work world. And this could be either with regards to our physical footprint in terms of office space or the amount of travel that we do. Do you think these changes are going to be permanent, or once things settle back down to normal, we'll fall back into our old habits?
So let me sort of personalize it, just to talk about my experience and what I might learn from that. I mean, some of the things I see are, you really get to see across a company the people who are really driving things now. So in a big company, most people are driving things. And at a time like this, you see that it's perhaps a smaller group. And I think that's very clarifying to watch that. I think you also see the speed at which you can operate in a crisis. And you think to yourself, I never really want to go back to operating at the previous speed if we can go at this speed. But then there are some more subjective things. Like, I've moved from a life of travel and constantly working in person with people, meeting new people every day, going to many places, to a life of all day on video. And there are, I think, some small benefits. I'm pretty efficient on video. I can quickly talk to people for 5 minutes. I can get a lot done. I can get all sorts of groups together. I don't waste any time between meetings. I probably have more actual business productive time in a day than I've ever had before. But at the same time, I'm finding it pretty awful. It's relentless, it's tiring, and it's just not very human to me. I mean, I've never really thought of myself as a real people person, but I can't tell you how much I want to go out and almost touch people and see them and talk to them and laugh and have lunch and have drinks and do all these things. So maybe I'm not the best case, but I think for me, that my life will have been changed now. I will do work in a different way. This remote element of it will become bigger, but I'll also shift a lot back to the old way if I can.
So, and this brings us to the issue of agility. Right, and in this context, many firms have been forced to become more agile in order just to survive. Do you think this experience with COVID-19 will be a good learning experience, and how will firms become more agile going forward?
So I think this is perhaps the best learning experience, because I've always thought of agility has many elements, but I think the core element is an agile business has decisions made spread through the entire business. They're not slowed down by a centralized bureaucracy where each decision has to get stalled and then elevated. And what we've seen here, especially in the way the crisis has played out, is every country has been different, every office has been different, and we've all had to make really fast decisions. So what I've seen across many of the companies we're working for and my own company is that everyone has become empowered. All of the local offices have really had to step up, and they've done a terrific job. And I suspect they will never want to give that power back, because it gives you energy and lets you make changes. And I think if we can harness that in a lot of businesses now, that will make us generally faster.
And so this brings me to my last question, Scott, which is there a silver lining? Do you see any opportunity for firms going forward as a result of this crisis?
No, you saved the hardest question until last.
Exactly.
I mean, if my hypothesis in your first question was right, and that this is more of a 50 to 100 year shock than a business cycle shock, it means that the world will change after this. We won't just settle back into the old pattern. And some of the assumptions we've made about how capitalism works, how wealth distribution works, how cooperation works, and how we prioritize the importance of various things will shift. And I think so we have an opportunity over the next couple of years as we deal with the economic fallout and as we deal with what's going to happen with that wealth redistribution to rewrite the rules and improve the way things are working. And I mean, it's probably obvious to you all, but you know, I really am a capitalist and I really am a globalist. Mm-hmm. But in both of those areas, I think we have enormous improvements to make and refinements to the models. And we've been tinkering the last few years. We know there's refinements we need to make, and we've been making them. But we can go faster. And I think this gives us the opportunity to do that. Now, in the face of the pain that's coming, I think on the human and economic side, that may seem like a small opportunity, but I think it's a long-term important one.
Well, that brings us to the close of our interview, Scott. I would just like to thank you very much for taking the time to share with us your thoughts and insights with regards to the COVID-19 crisis and its impact on the world economy.